Ladies and gentlemen, I hope if you've not had your coffee, you're about to get it, but I think we should get started. You may have noticed when you came here midday, there was a rival event going on in the Festival Theatre, Britain's Got Talent. And we were a bit worried that some of you might decide that you would be better off there than here, but you're obviously realise you're much better off here. Now, it's my very great pleasure to introduce Dame Stella Rimington, who needs no introduction. I've got lots of information about her, but I'm going to keep it brief because she's going to tell us a lot about her life. She was born in South London, moved around England with her family, and was educated at Nottingham High School for Girls. And then she saw the light and decided to come to Edinburgh University in the 1950s to read English. Thereafter, she went to Liverpool University to study archive administration. Then, with her husband, she moved to New Delhi to the British High Commission, where he was a first secretary, and Dame Stella, she then was, assisted another first secretary who she subsequently realised worked for MI5. So that's what she did, and then when they came back to London, she moved permanently to MI5. And the rest is history, as they say. She worked in all three branches of the security service: counter-espionage, counter-subversion, and counter-terrorism. And she made a significant contribution to MI5. She retired in 1996 as DCB, Dame Commander of the Order of the Bath, which was interesting. Post MI5, she's a non-executive director of various companies, including Marks and Spencer's. She wrote, somewhat controversially, her biography, Open Secret, in 2001, and she has become a highly successful spy novelist with inside information. She's written 6, and she's just finishing her 7th. And last year, you may know that she was the chairman of the Man Booker Prize, which is a major undertaking. With that little summary, I have great pleasure in welcoming Dame Stella Rimington.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much, Alan, for that introduction. And I'm going to put on my glasses, which I'm afraid are cockeyed because I've sat on them. So if I look rather peculiar, that's why. So it is more than 55 years since I first walked into the old college to sit at the feet of such venerable scholars as Professor John McMurray, who taught me the elements of moral philosophy. And I must say, with his tall figure and his long white beard, he looked to me like one of the ancients himself. And there was also another person I remember very well, who is somebody called Dr. Schramm, who introduced me to Beowulf and Anglo-Saxon and explained how languages change and the sounds move around the world. And I was very impressed by these gentlemen, although I must say that I've long forgotten exactly what I was taught. But I think that the whole experience of being here, the learning, the relationships, the freedom and independence, and the fun and the hard work have all played a really important part, actually, in forming my personality and the way I've behaved and looked at the world ever since then. So I have a great deal to thank Edinburgh University for. But when I left here, 4 years after I'd arrived with my MA in English Lang and Lit, I had no career aim, I do have to tell you. In fact, I didn't really plan to be a career woman at all. Those of you who are as old as I am will remember, we women, in fact, we weren't really expected to have careers. We were expected to do some sort of little job until we got married, or at the very most, until we had children. So I certainly didn't plan to join MI5, and in fact, it certainly wasn't a profession that you could plan to join in those days. The intelligence services in those days were almost totally invisible to everybody. MI6 was not even acknowledged to exist. And nobody knew who worked in British intelligence. Nobody knew where it was. Nobody knew what it did. And above all, of course, nobody knew how you joined. And in fact, you had to wait. And I'll tell you about what happened to me later on. And I think if I told the career advisor here that my plan was to be the head of MI5, they would have sent for a psychiatrist. Now, of course, there's a website setting out the jobs that are available, and you can apply online. And quite recently, if you Googled Russian intelligence service, you got a sponsored advertisement for jobs in MI5. So the world has changed quite a bit, actually. So having decided that I didn't know what I wanted to do when I finished here, I scoured the university handbooks for another course, as I think most people do when they don't know what they want to do. And I discovered a course in the administration of archives and the study of records at the University of Liverpool. So I went off to do that for a year, and I became an archivist in the Worcestershire County Record Office. And the job of an archivist, of course, is to preserve historical records of the county and the diocese for historians and other people to use. And I'm sure you all know that, but it wasn't actually very well known in those days what on earth an archivist was. And one of the things I had to do was go around the county giving talks about my work as an archivist. And I don't think I can have been very good at it, because I can remember after one such talk in a school, the head girl got up to give the vote of thanks, and she said, "Well, thank you very much indeed, Miss Whitehouse," as I then was, "for telling us all about your work as an anchovy." And so I thought, well, that's a job I failed in anyway. Anyway, after a little while in Worcester, I went off to work in the India Office Library, and I got married. And my husband at that time worked in the Board of Trade. And one day he came home and said he'd been offered a post, as you've heard from Alan, in the British High Commission in New Delhi as a first secretary. What did I think? And I thought, great, you know, this is the moment when I give up work, and I'm going to do what I'm kind of scheduled to do, which is become a wife. And I went off then to be a diplomatic wife in India. And there I was doing what diplomats' wives did in those days, which I have to say was not very much, except organising coffee mornings and appearing in amateur dramatics, when somebody sidled up to me in the British High Commission compound and said, "Psst, do you want to be a spy?" Or something like that. These were different times, and I can remember when I was writing my autobiography, I dug out the little brown book which the Commonwealth Relations Office had given to we wives setting off on our diplomatic postings. And it really is a flavour of the times, and I'll just quote you a couple of things it said. It said, "A fur wrap will come in useful. It can be cold in the evenings in winter, and shoulders covered with goose pimples are not attractive. Waist slips are more useful than full-length slips, but take a supply of elastic. All elastic rots, but Indian elastic rots twice as fast." So armed with this sort of wonderful information, which I think says a lot for the times, I went off to do this posting and found myself joining MI5. Where I didn't know anything about MI5, like nobody did, as I say. In those days, MI5 had some small offices scattered all around the Commonwealth because one of their jobs was to advise Commonwealth countries on their security. And so what we were actually doing in Delhi was trying to, I mean, it was the height of the Cold War, you have to remember, and Delhi was a place where East met West, and it was absolutely full of spooks from both sides of the divide in the Cold War. And our job was really to try and find out who the spies on the other side of the Cold War divide were, in order to warn our colleagues and warn the Indian government, etc. So that's what we were actually doing. But of course, I didn't really know anything much about this. And what I was recruited as was a part-time clerk typist. And the fact that I couldn't type didn't actually seem to matter, really, because it was far more in those days about who you were than what you could actually do. And as the wife of a diplomat, of course, I was regarded as okay and safe. So that was why I got recruited, not because of my perfect typing. I did, in fact, think, when I discovered that this was all about spies, I thought I knew about spies because we'd just been on a rather exciting journey driving from Delhi through Pakistan over the Khyber Pass to Afghanistan. And I had been reading Kipling's Kim, that wonderful book about British officers disguised as horse traders on the northwest frontier. And I thought it was going to be all like, like this rather, and we were going to be discovering, spies disguised as horse traders selling carpets and heaven knows what. It wasn't actually much like that, but as I say, it was really quite exciting. One of the things on our magnificent journey over the Khyber Pass, one of the things, again, that sort of speaks to the period was that we had taken with us all the costumes for the Christmas pantomime that was going to take place in the British Embassy in Kabul. It was Cinderella. Can you imagine nowadays the British Embassy in Kabul performing Cinderella to an amazed audience? So anyway, that's how it was. And as I say, there was a lot of spying going on in those days. So when we went back to London, I decided that this was all a great deal more exciting than being an archivist, and I applied for a full-time job in MI5. But I have to say, it was a bit of a disappointment at first, because what I hadn't known out in India was that MI5 was run exclusively by men. And they were assisted at the time by a certain number of well-bred, but not necessarily terribly well-educated ladies who dealt with the paperwork. And they really were, the sort of backroom girls, and the men went out and ran things and got all the intelligence and did everything. So one of the first things I had to do was join a training section, and the training section was presided over by a couple of these ladies. And much to my amazement, when it got to 12 noon, these ladies sort of pulled open their desk drawer and took out bottles of fine sherry and cut glasses and helped themselves to an elegant pre-lunch drink. And I realized I'd arrived in the land of the eccentrics. But there was a serious job to do. MI5 at the time was very closed, inward-looking, and one of the reasons, of course, was the fear of infiltration. As I say, this was the height of the Cold War, and you've only got to think back to the Cambridge spies, Burgess, Philby, Maclean, etc., to realise that it was a very serious fear. I mean, one of the main objectives of the intelligence services on both sides of the divide was to infiltrate the others, to find out what was going on. So this was a very closed society I joined. We weren't allowed to talk about what we did or where we did it, really. There were all kinds of rules about what you could say to whom, and as far as I can remember, it really consisted mostly of saying nothing to nobody about nothing. There was one specific rule I remember, which was that if you were female, you could tell your fiancé where you worked, but not your boyfriend, which I think is a distinction that might be rather difficult to operate nowadays. There were no laws or oversights to govern what we did in those days. Contact with government and the civil service was extremely limited. There was a sort of mutual avoidance pact really going on in those days. Although the Home Secretary was responsible for what we did, there was a sort of fear that if they inquired too deeply into what we were doing, there might be embarrassment for the government, embarrassment for the civil service. And we feared, on our part, I think the bosses in those days feared too much interest, would involve interference, and we might not be able to do the things that we had to do. So there was this sort of standoff. There were very limited foreign contacts in those days as well, mainly the United States and the Commonwealth countries, for the same fear that the person you were talking to might have been recruited by the other side, this fear of infiltration which governed everything. There was another problem for women, which, as I've said, was that MI5 was running this two-tier system in those days, and there were literally two career structures, one for the men and one for the women. And the women were assistant officers, and it was very difficult, really, to transfer from, being another rank to being an officer, which was what the men were. The job of MI5, as I'm sure most of you know, is to try and protect us from threats to our national security by gathering preemptive intelligence and analysing it and acting on it in conjunction with the police and other parts of the government machine. One of the most important sources of intelligence, even in today's technological world, is people. The spy, deep in the heart of the opposing intelligence service, or the terrorist in the terrorist organisation. And identifying those people, recruiting them, and running them long term to provide you with a long-term intelligence stream is one of the most important things to be done. In my early days, human sources were most likely to be Irishmen, because we were dealing with Irish terrorism, East European intelligence officers or members of the KGB, etc. And that is, as I say, the sharp end of intelligence work. But in the 1970s, as it then was, this was not regarded as women's work. As I say, women were for the paperwork. Intelligence analysis, if you were thought to be quite bright. But by and large, you stayed at your desk and the men went out and gathered the intelligence. As the 70s went on, and women's lib arrived, and sex discrimination legislation, etc., and we began to recruit a number of women like me, with good educations, etc., we began to say to ourselves, hey, hang on a minute, why are we in this kind of second-class structure? We reckon we could do this work just as well as the men. And so we mounted what was, in fact, a quiet revolution. No bra burning or sticking up posters or anything like that. It wouldn't have gone down well in that kind of an organisation in those days. But it was effective, really. And the bosses, they puffed their pipes and scratched their heads and wondered what they were going to do about this. And in the end decided that what they were going to have to do was try some of us out. And I was the first woman to be allowed to go on the course that was designed to train us for the skills we needed to recruit and run these human sources. And I can remember thinking, great, this is the breakthrough. Women are on their way now. But when I got on this course, it was quite clear that it was designed entirely for men, because the first thing you had to do, the first exercise, was that you had to go into a pub, and using some cover story that you'd created, you had to try and find out as much as you possibly could about anybody in this pub. And then, unbeknownst to you, somebody from the course was going to come in and blow your cover story, and the test was how well you dealt with these two bits of the exercise. I was given my pub, which was a very sleazy dump near Victoria Station in London. I can remember this pub to this day. I went in and I stood at the door and I surveyed the bar, which was all full of men, of course, because we're talking about the early 70s now. And they all seemed to me to be men in dirty Macs leaning on the bar, drinking pints. And I went up to one of these guys and started chatting him up. And it was quite clear that he was beginning to think my purpose was something quite different from intelligence gathering, when the man from the course came in to blow my cover story, and I treated him as a bit of a saviour, actually, because I'd got myself into a difficult situation. And, of course, when I was doing that job, really, I would never have used a pub like that. So they'd thought, a certain distance, but they hadn't thought quite far enough. Anyway, in those days, the overwhelming threat to the UK security came from espionage and subversion from the Soviet Union and their East European allies, as they tried to gather intelligence to help them if the Cold War had ever turned to a fighting war, and to subvert Western democracies and spread world communism. And those were the days that John le Carré's novels, I think, portray brilliantly, really. And it is true that people were leaving sort of piles of documents in hollow trees on Hampstead Heath in return for cash. It was all going on in broadly the way that John le Carré's novels describe. And our job, of course, was to try and find out what was going on and stop it. Those were the days of slow, careful investigation, aimed at the expulsion of the spy, the recruitment of the spy, the prosecution of the spy, etc. But in the 70s and on into the 80s, a new threat was arriving that was going to change everything about the organisation I joined. Northern Irish terrorism and international terrorism, as we called it even then, arrived at about the same time, really, in the early 1970s. And they needed a completely different approach. Careful investigation, human sources, all the same techniques were required, but what was needed now was analysis at speed. There was none of the kind of leisured approach to countering espionage. And of course, you can't take action on everything you learn. Judgments have got to be made in the terrorist field about what you've got to act on and what you can ignore. And it's about balancing risks in a difficult area. And it requires nerve, because the penalty for getting it wrong is huge. It can be, obviously, loss of life, the destruction of property on a large scale. and it can be blame as everybody picks over what you've done or haven't done at leisure afterwards and criticises you. Even if you get it right, of course, you often can't get any credit for your success, because the whole point about intelligence operations is it's the ones you don't hear about that have been the successes, and the ones you do hear about have really been the failures. So that was the beginning, I think, of the situation that my former colleagues are now dealing with in a much more enhanced way. And it began to bring us out from behind these shadows that I've been talking about. A successful terrorist operation ends in court, and so lawyers have to see the files. The staff have to appear in court giving evidence. New international contacts were needed, as terrorism is often planned and financed in one place to take place in another, and information's got to be quickly passed around the world. And government ministers, of course, started to take a very close interest in our investigations. And it wasn't always a very comfortable period. And I can remember when I was director of counter-terrorism, I used to have to go across to Number 10 to brief the Prime Minister, who was John Major at the time, on what was going on. And the sort of thing I sometimes had to say to him was, well, Prime Minister, we know that the IRA is about to bring in a large lorry bomb. We don't know which port it's coming in at. We don't know when it's coming in, and we don't know what the target is. But, Prime Minister, I thought you should know. And it's not what you want to have to tell the boss, actually. But he was marvellous. To do him credit, he used to sort of close his eyes and lean back in his chair and say, oh, well, Stella, do your best. And that was exactly what he should have said. And we did our best. And very often, you know, those bombs never went off because we managed to get adequate preemptive intelligence to stop it. So while terrorism was on the rise, all of a sudden, the Cold War came to an end with remarkable suddenness. And the totalitarian governments of Eastern Europe and eventually the Soviet Union began to collapse, really, towards the end of the 80s and the early 90s. For us, this was a massive opportunity because we were able to make contact with those people who'd been our enemies all my working life. And we offered them help in recruiting and in changing their position from working in totalitarian states to working in democracies. And in return, we got from them their knowledge of terrorists, because some of those countries had sponsored terrorism as a way of getting at the West. And we visited the headquarters of these services, and much whiskey and vodka was drunk far into the night as we swapped stories about what we'd been trying to do to each other during the Cold War. And troops of Bulgarians and Hungarians came through our training sections, and it was a completely new world that really took our breath away. But I think the most remarkable event for me was a visit I paid to Moscow in December 1991 to make our first contact with the KGB. And it came about because Douglas Hurd, who was Foreign Secretary at the time, had met the man whom Yeltsin had put in charge of the KGB. And this man was a true Democrat, and I think Yeltsin had wanted him to kind of reform and change the KGB, and Douglas Hurd had identified this guy as, you know, somebody who was going to do that. And he said to him, we've just been legislating for our intelligence services, would you like some people to come out and explain to the KGB how they have to change to work in a democracy? And he said yes. So I and a couple of colleagues went out to the Lubyanka. And, you know, the Lubyanka, their office, the KGB's office, over the years has been sort of prison, torture chamber, death cell. And you could just kind of feel a nastiness oozing out of the stones, really. And there we sat, facing a long line of KGB officers, explaining to them how you have to work in intelligence services in a democracy. And they clearly had no intention of changing in any way whatsoever. And while we did some sightseeing outside our meetings, there they were covertly following us around, you know, in a very Cold War-ish kind of way. And of course, you know, that didn't last. The man whom Douglas Hurd had met was out of the KGB within months, actually, and they went back to their very same ways. But I suppose that was when I had my true James Bond moment, really, driving in the British ambassador's Rolls-Royce with the Union flag flying at the bonnet to go and have dinner with the KGB in one of their safe houses on a snowy Moscow night. And that's one of my best memories, really, I think, of my time at MI5. So much had changed since I joined MI5, all bringing us out from kind of behind our shadows. And the most, I suppose, the result of all that was that just after I got back from Moscow, I was told that I was going to be the next Director General. And almost in the same breath, they said, and by the way, it's been decided that when you're appointed, we're going to announce the appointment and your name. And I sort of swallowed, and I thought, this is going to be a bit of a furore. And of course it was. The announcement was not well managed. Nobody had made a sort of press, plan, as you would normally. And so the media suddenly had this announcement about a woman in a man's job, as they saw it, with no explanation, nobody to go on the telly to explain why they'd done it, etc. And that brought me face to face for the first time with the tabloid press. I was a woman, so the tabloid press's first reaction was, get back in the kitchen where you belong. And we had headlines like, housewife, super spy. And there was another one, mother of two gets tough with terrorists. They came and camped outside the house, annoying the neighbours. And one woman said to me, I wish you wouldn't go to work just as I'm taking my children to school. And I think the implication of that was obvious. If they tried to shoot me and missed, they might get her and her children. So we decided at the moment when the press started to take covert photographs of me unloading my shopping from the boot of my car on a Saturday morning, we decided we had to get a grip of this. I got very annoyed by this because one newspaper had a headline made up which was, British women in public life, why do they look so much worse than the French? And there was a French minister at the time, in, I think it was Mitterrand's government, called Elizabeth Guigou, and she had been photographed in her office, sort of leaning on her desk, with her hair beautifully coiffured, wearing Yves Saint Laurent or something. And she was French women in public life. And then there was me in my tateo Barber and jeans unloading my shopping from the boot of the car. And that was British women in public life. And I came to hate that woman. I never met her, but, So we decided we'd got to get a grip of this. So we formed what we described as our openness strategy. And we published a booklet about what a security service does in a democracy. And we invited the editors of the broadsheets to lunch. And I did the Dimbleby lecture on BBC television with a very current subject, which is there a conflict between security and democracy? And people are still talking about that subject to this day. And it is a very serious one. And that lecture was reported in the broadsheets quite widely with a very sensible debate. But one journalist wrote that I had very large ears and that these must be very useful in covert communication. So, and contrary to our plan to sideline James Bond and get a realistic press, M became a woman, played by Judi Dench, and looking surprisingly like I looked at the time. So we felt that, dreadful old James Bond had come back with our best efforts to get rid of him. So I retired from MI5 15 years ago now, and I reinvented myself, as you've heard, as chairman of a charity, a business mentor, and a non-executive director on the boards of various companies, including Marks and Spencer. And it wasn't, I have to say, a very easy transition. I did find that when I first went into Marks and Spencer in 1997, I think it was, that the headquarters of Marks and Spencer in Baker Street looked surprisingly like a rather posh version of the MI5 that I joined in 1970. And I don't at all think that I really fitted in terribly well with all those men. It was quite clear that one woman non-executive director on the board of Marks and Spencer was what they wanted, no more at that particular time. And I have to say, I was rocked back on my heels to be called dear by the chairman of Marks and Spencer in 1997. And I find it really quite depressing that business is still talking about the appropriate number of women on the boards of companies, etc. And even the prime ministers got on the bandwagon, I read in the newspaper. I just wonder, whether the business world is ever going to catch up and realise that women are actually normal, and you can kind of have them around in as many numbers as are actually appropriate. And finally, of course, I reinvented myself as an author. And I wrote my autobiography, as Alan said, in 2001. And I thought I'd written it rather carefully, actually, and certainly not, to shock in any way. And when I submitted it to the clearance process in Whitehall, there was a sort of deathly silence. And I wondered whatever was going on. Nobody said anything. And I know now that they'd gone into a kind of cultural shock, and they didn't quite know what to do about this. And then all of a sudden, somebody within the clearance process put this uncleared manuscript into a brown paper envelope and sent it to the Sun newspaper. I suppose the plan was to try and scupper the thing altogether. But the Sun didn't know what to do with it, so they put it in another brown paper envelope and sent it back to number 10 Downing Street with a press photographer. And that started a huge, great furore about whether I should or shouldn't be allowed to write this rather, small and not frightfully revealing autobiography. But anyway, I took out all the things they asked me to take out, and I did. And now I write thrillers, fulfilling a long-held ambition about a female MI5 officer called Liz Carlisle. And as you've heard, I'm just about finishing the 7th, and that brings me back to Edinburgh rather pleasantly from time to time to go to the book festival, and led to my being chairman of the Booker Prize judges last year, which involved reading 135 novels in, I think it was 8 months. They start coming in December, and you've got to make your mind up round about August. So it is hard work, and if anybody ever asks you to be a judge of the Booker Prize, say no, because it will take over your life completely for a whole year. And I think my experience of doing that made me realise that the literary world is just about as full of piranhas as the KGB, and has about as much sense of humour as well. Anyway, I think it's enough from me. Just to conclude, one thing I have discovered is that whatever you do, after 30 years or so in the secret world, you never quite lose that aura of mystery. And I can remember that shortly after I retired, I went to a dinner given by a very significant British company for the diplomatic corps in London. And I found myself sitting at the same table as the ambassador of a former Soviet bloc country and some very senior British businessmen. And I saw this ambassador guy looking at me all through the first course. And then when the second course came along, he suddenly announced to the whole table, "She knows the names of all my mistresses." And there was a frisson went around the table. I could see all these British businessmen looking at me out of the corner of their eye. And they were wondering, and I knew what they were wondering. They were wondering if I knew the names of all their mistresses too. And it's something I like to keep them wondering about, actually, to this day. Thank you very much. Take the mic.
That's fine, yeah. Dame Stella, thank you very much for that. Now, she's very kindly agreed to answer questions, so Mary has the microphone. Who would like to ask Dame Stella or comment on what she's said? Can I just ask the first question? Yeah. You retired 15 years ago, and you've written these wonderful books, and they're so up to date. You know so much. How do you keep up to date with what's going on?
Well, I read the newspapers. I like the plots to be very current. So I write about things which I know are going on at the moment, like Somali pirates and cyber warfare and such like. And I do that really by, reading what's going on in the world and then applying my knowledge of how the intelligence services will be dealing with those things to put together a plot which I hope is sort of realistic and current.
Right. Question?
There's a question over there.
Right.
Dame Stella, with the benefit of your experience, do you have any advice for the citizens of a small country in the process of debating the merits or otherwise of independence about the implications for their national security?
Golly, I hesitate to make any comment on independence here. And I would think that if this small country does go independent, it's going to share the national security with a country it's become independent from, because I think it would be extremely difficult and probably not sensible to create your own, national security structures. And I would have thought that, with the goodness of our heart, we'll probably allow you to benefit from the intelligence that we have south of the border.
Ready?
Dame Stella, I've read your autobiography and 2 of your spy thrillers, which I thoroughly enjoyed. Why was it that prior to your time, everything was frightfully secret and nobody knew who the boss was? Why did they suddenly decide to expose you?
Well, it's an interesting point, and I think it's a combination of things. I mean, firstly, I think they thought it was a good equality announcement, and that's always appealing to a government. But secondly, we'd reached a point, really, where the Cold War had come to an end, and people were beginning to say, we don't need you lot anymore, you're all about spying. And I think it was regarded as important that we were able to explain ourselves, and we were able to do it on the basis of legislation, which by then existed, so that the security service and the other intelligence services had become statutory organisations, and that's a much sounder base to go public about the sort of things you do than the earlier period where we had no legislative base on which we rested at all. So I think it was just a combination of things that all, reached a moment when they felt that greater openness was appropriate, and so did we.
Right, there's a question there. Right, yes.
Dame Stella, thank you very much. Most interesting talk. I've heard it said, and I'm speaking as a former historian of very itinerant background, military intelligence is a contradiction in terms. Could you comment? Could you comment on that?
I think a lot of people think intelligence is a contradiction in terms, and intelligence services never get everything right, and I think it's very important to make the point that there's no such thing as 100% intelligence, and that what you what you think you know today may be contradicted by something you learn tomorrow. So the whole idea, I mean, going back to this sort of famous dossier before the war in Iraq, my feeling very strongly about that was that it was a great mistake to put intelligence into the public domain in a way that makes people think that you are encapsulating for all time the situation, because as I say, what you know today may be contradicted tomorrow. So I thought that was a huge mistake, and I think it did a lot of damage actually to the intelligence services, military intelligence, civil intelligence, etc., because people thought that the intelligence services didn't know what the hell they were talking about, which of course is not true. There is a great deal of really hard intelligence which is fed to the government every day and which formulates our policies. But once you start putting it into the public domain and saying, this is it, frozen, then it's a huge mistake. So intelligence services play a vital part in keeping us all safe.
Does your understanding of the risks of cyber terrorism lead you to think that we are over-reliant on technology in public life? And is there anything that you do to protect yourself against the risks of it all coming crumbling down that we might want to copy?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we may be over-reliant on technology, but we're not going to go back. I feel, that if anything, we're going to go forward. You can't halt the advance, but what we all have to do is be more aware of how to protect ourselves. And I think it's an extremely difficult problem that the finest minds in GCHQ, etc., are attempting to address. And I don't think we're anywhere, nationally, I don't think we are yet anywhere near being able to, totally protect ourselves because of the advance of technology. Moving forward, in parallel with the defences, the attacks move forward. We're all carrying out cyber attacks, of course. It's not things only being done to us. I'm quite sure we're doing it to others. But, I think it is one of the current problems of the day, and I don't think we have mastered it. And I don't think we're anywhere near mastering it, I'm afraid. And I have no solution to it. I'm sorry to be negative, but that's how it is.
James, and then the principal.
Yes, Dame Stella, my query is about covert work, which perhaps is one of the most dangerous aspects of the work of MI5. Do people volunteer to do that, or do you have to recruit, or both? You
mean the recruiting of sources?
Yes, indeed.
Yes. You have to recruit. I mean, there are two aspects to this. One is the MI5 officers who run the sources, and the other is the sources themselves. And, you might ask yourself what motivates somebody who is a terrorist to start, to change sides and give information to Her Majesty's government. And the answer is many, many different things. And the skill of the intelligence officers is to find out who people are who are vulnerable to that kind of an approach make the approach and then keep the person in place so that they can continue to give a stream of information. It's the most important part of the work of the intelligence service, well, nearly, and it's difficult, but it's vital. And then, of course, you've got to kind of analyse and assess what you've learned and decide if it makes sense, etc. So it's all part of the sort of cake of intelligence work, but the recruiting and running of sources is very important. People will do it, most people will do it during the course of a career in MI5, for example. It's one of the things you do.
Dame Stella, absolutely wonderful presentation. I mean, if you look at the great successes in the Second World War, with Bletchley Park and such, these were almost entirely mechanical and not personal. And then if you look at a lot of the successes related to Northern Ireland, they were personal and not mechanical, if I can put it that way. They were to do with individuals. In the current environment, and with the ability to monitor emails, monitor mobile phone traffic, monitor the movement of individuals, because their phones tell people, I mean, for the modern intelligence service, what proportion is likely in this cake we've just been discussing to be to do with the individual who tells us what Al-Qaeda or the hostile body is going to do, and what proportion is going to be mechanical, the sort of systematic use of technology to monitor what everybody's doing?
Yes. Well, both are vital, and I can't say what proportion is what, but you are right in saying that, you know, the complex technological sources of intelligence are increasingly important, but so is the person who is actually there and can tell you what everybody around the table is thinking in an up-to-date sort of way. But you've got to put this all together. I mean, intelligence really is a matter of taking your information from all sources, making sense of it, working out which of what you're learning is true, and then, very importantly, what you're going to do about it. So it's just a more and more complex cake, I think, in which all these things have to come together. And the analysis of intelligence is a vital part of it.
Dame Stella, thanks very much for that talk. Do you think it's easier now or more difficult for the intelligence services to coordinate their work with all the other agencies that seem to have an interest in investigating terrorism or similar organizations in this country? Because I'll be reading the newspapers recently about the police trying to infiltrate different organizations and getting it right and getting it wrong.
Well, it's not easy, even within one's own country, let alone when you're trying to coordinate with what's going on in allied countries as well. But I think we're better at it than we used to be. We've got more experience. There are more kind of joint units now than when I first joined MI5. The police were always complaining that we never told them anything until the moment they had to go out and arrest somebody. Now there is joint units within MI5 who assess and analyse the terrorist information and work out who's going to do what and at what point the police are going to take action and all that. So I think it's better than it used to be. It's never going to be perfect, but I think we in this country are better than, for example, the Americans. And the example of 9/11 showed that in the United States, the American agencies were really not communicating with each other properly at all. I don't know to what extent they've improved that now. I think they have a bit, but size, works against it. But, I mean, the other thing now is the vast number of international services that they have to liaise with, some of whom don't have the same kind of standards that we have, and you get problems, the torture issues, etc., come into this aspect of it. So I think it's always going to be difficult, and people are always going to want to hold to themselves their most sensitive intelligence gained from people in very difficult situations. So it's an ongoing problem that people are very aware of and always trying to improve.
Alan?
Thank you, Dame Stella. I was interested in a recent judgment in the English courts, which seemed to me to be different in that a number of individuals have received indeterminate sentences, not for an act of terrorism, but for planning an act of terrorism. Do you see that as a milestone, and what's your thinking on that?
Yeah, I mean, that represents change, recent changes in the law. I mean, my feeling was that under the last government, the attempts to change the law had gone too far and were beginning to intrude in a dangerous way into our civil liberties. And I mean, there is a fine balance, I feel strongly about this, to be maintained by any government between our rights to a private life and the government's responsibility to look after us. And I think all governments have got to walk that line extremely carefully, and I felt that under the last government they'd walked far too far into our civil liberties. I think this government has drawn back from that in a very sensible way, and I feel reasonably comfortable with the situation that we have now. I mean, we're dealing with some very difficult situations, and the most recent cleric who is being let out of prison and is likely to be roaming the streets is an example of the difficulties that obviously that the human rights legislation meeting the need to look after us all. And, you know, I think all these things are going to have to be dealt with as individual situations, and I hope that some kind of sensible solution is going to come out of it. But I think it's a very important area where governments have got to keep a very sharp eye on what's going on.
Fine. I think it's time we let Dame Stella off the hook. Was there one last question? Or two? David and then the lady. And that, two more questions.
Thank you very much, Dame Stella. I recently found myself in the headquarters of the CIA in Washington, and I was walking along a corridor when I passed what I thought was a broom cupboard. And the sign on the door in very small print said, Office of Clandestine Operations. Would there ever have been such a broom cupboard in MI5, and what would it mean?
What would it mean is a question. I don't know what it meant, because I would have thought that the whole place was an Office of Clandestine Operations. I don't know. There would never have been a notice like that in MI5. We would have thought it was just too ridiculous. And it probably, maybe it was a joke, I don't know. But maybe it was like one of those Alice in Wonderland things. You opened the door and an enormous, great sort of collection of people slaving away would have been there. But heaven knows what it meant.
This may be a kind of related question, actually. Now, you mentioned John le Carré, but you didn't mention Ian Fleming. And I think we were all brought up on Q and James Bond and those special equipment that James Bond was provided with. Was there any truth in any of that?
So, yes, some of it. It's highly exaggerated, of course, and you know, all the things he had on his car, etc., you know, were just for fun, really. But gadgetry is very important. And, you know, the means to intercept communications, eavesdrop and overhear conversations and communicate with people in difficult places whom you can't meet. All those things are the gadgetry, the serious gadgetry, and now increasingly, you know, the sort of technology of intercepting emails and such like. So, yes, gadgetry, but not exploding cigars and the sort of thing that Q seemed to specialise in.
Fine. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk, Dame Stella.
Okay, thank you.
It's somewhat daunting in a room of people whose CVs exemplify the fact that University of Edinburgh alumni have talent, to be the one to whom it falls to thank Dame Stella Rimington on your behalf. But I think you'll agree that we have had not just any after-lunch speaker, to purloin the words of a well-known advertisement, but we have had a University of Edinburgh General Counsel after-lunch speaker who has been quite outstanding in giving us such a fascinating insight into a rapidly changing world, an example of a career that has broken boundaries at every step, that has I think exemplified and expressed a number of the values that we hold very dear in the University of Edinburgh around negotiating openness and transparency, around equality, around speed in adapting to a rapidly changing world, in showing good judgment in negotiating in an international world. You've educated us, you've informed us, and you have entertained us, and I'm sure that I am speaking on behalf of the room in thanking you very much indeed for a terrific talk. Thank you.